Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Spotlight on Security Tech Insights. Today, we are going to talk about cyber response planning best practices. As many organizations are faced with cyber attacks, enterprise resilience is more and more important than ever. Having a plan for preparedness and response from cyber incidents is absolutely necessary. So, my name is Theresa Miller. I am the Director of Technical Advocacy here at Cohesity, and I have spent many years as a practitioner, also with a security focus. And I am joined today by a very special guest who's extremely versed in this space. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Jonathon Mayor. Current title is Senior Security Solutions Architect. Been with Cohesity for a number of years, but been in the industry for several decades at this point. Like Theresa, doing a bunch of different things, most notably computer forensic or digital forensics, and then as a hobbyist with a focus on lock sports and physical security.
That's awesome. So let's get started. Let's dive in. I'm really curious to know, Jonathon, why does incident response matter when doing cyber response planning? Can you talk about this from your experiences?
Well, yeah, it's funny because so many of the conversations I've had just over the past several years, it's really clarifying the difference between disaster recovery and incident response. Because, when we talk about responding to a cyber event, it's very tempting, especially if you've never actually been through an attack, to think that, oh, well, I've got this disaster recovery plan and it works really well. We've used it before and it was flawless. That's gonna be sufficient. And what we find is that it is absolutely not sufficient, and it in a lot of ways is way more dangerous, because the key with disaster recovery is we provide a lot of training internally and externally, and the best way I've seen it described is through an analogy of a tree, where with a DR type situation, those are finite things you understand: fire, floods, storms, wind, those kinds of things. So it's a relatively finite set of issues that you're going to be dealing with, and they're relatively stable. The fire is not going to change into a hurricane in the middle of the fire, right? Whereas with incident response and cyber attacks, it's more like a poisoning event. And so before you can even do anything to protect the tree, you have to even recognize that there's something wrong. And then that may be very subtle, and it may have been going on for a long time, and you're not really sure where it's coming from. And so it's this incident response part. It's more of an investigation to really understand the situation before you can even make a diagnosis, to then get into the corrective phases of things. And that's another way to look at it, is attackers, once they get into the environment, their whole objective, especially in ransomware and wiper type attacks, which are the destructive ones that we see the most, their whole objective is to know your plan probably better than you and to disrupt it. And so when you're thinking about cyber response planning, you really need to focus on flexibility. It's great to have the plan, but then to think about how is that plan going to change when the things it depends on get undermined.
Those are all such really great points. I love your analogy around disaster recovery. I think while that seems fundamental and foundational, and a lot of organizations put effort into it, I think it's important to call out that your disaster recovery plan could actually be propagating or poisoning, as you mentioned it, the infected state to your DR site. So you're not going to want to assume that all is okay and status quo. So I really appreciate that analogy. I think the other thing that I'd like to call out here is that foundationally, I think your employees are critical to incident response. And let me just share a little bit of an example. So one of the organizations that I worked in many years ago had a really great strategy around educating users on security. And it was a campaign of sorts that was ongoing my entire time there, which was a couple of years. And that part of that strategy was think before you click. And that really came to be beneficial because, like many organizations, we had systems that were externally accessible. And that external access, of course, while brokered through a virtual app or virtualization program of sorts and secured, still allowed access to the web through that tooling. And so we had a user click on something that felt suspicious. And because of the education we had done with the users in the organization, that person had no hesitation in calling that in. So they opened a ticket immediately. We were able to identify it as malware, but we didn't know if it was limited or, to that server, or if it had spread. So we put incident response efforts in place, right, to isolate that system and do further detection once we learned more. So I think your employees can be extremely beneficial if they're educated to handle these scenarios. Jonathon, do you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. And that's a perfect case that, your employees, just like with the analogy of the tree, right? If you think of each employee like one tiny little piece of the root system, you've got a lot of entry points into, causing problems. And so it's really important that as soon as anybody sees something wrong, even if it's something that they caused, that there's not a stigma around retaliation, that everybody's in it together to preserve the integrity and to minimize the risk to the organization. So, part of that is to really make sure that people understand the goal is not to never have to be faced with a response. The goal is to make sure you understand the risk, right? Because it's the number, the top attack vectors are phishing attempts and externally facing, applications, which is what you precisely, you just validated that. Mm-hmm. So it's a very safe assumption that at some point somebody's going to get in. Mm-hmm. It's too much of the probability will always be higher than zero that somebody's mm-hmm. going to get in. And so it's all about managing that risk. And that's where, since you laid out this great example in that company or in other places you've been, how did that mindset of assuming compromise, at least initially, affect preparation? What did they do differently?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So oftentimes a defense in depth approach, which is a pretty traditional term, I think that enterprises try to comply by, but defense in depth approach to detection and prevention. And so I'm going to take this really high level. Of course, it goes deeper, even more deeply than I'll go today, but we only have so much time with our audience today. So to me, it starts with intrusion detection. So how are you going to protect the perimeter? How are you going to detect threats that may be trying to poke holes into the access and the firewalling? Web detection, I already shared a pretty powerful example around web detection. So having additional mechanisms in place besides the user, sharing that information can be extremely valuable. And thankfully, there's tooling that can do that. And then, of course, there's the desktop and server level detection, with malware and ransomware being the most common software elements that you can deploy. But at a high level, I think that defense in depth approach goes a really long way towards prevention. And of course, maintaining those systems, it's not a set it and forget it approach. You have to do maintenance on that. Jonathan, what do you think?
Yeah, the defense in depth absolutely makes sense. The one that I see kind of really getting a lot more attention, especially with some of the AI capabilities coming out these days, is user access behavior. Because that's just like you were talking about, when somebody does fall victim to a phishing attempt, being able to quickly understand what is normal for that user and then call things out, that's really powerful and very helpful. And then, unfortunately, part of why we had to start, this conversation with just basic definitions is that there are, this is a good thing. A lot of organizations out there have not actually had to deal with a full bore incident response. The flip side of that is it's a really powerful thing to have lessons learned when you get to actually test these things in that kind of environment. Part of what I really enjoy about my current role is the conversations I get to have with customers. Some of it is, we provide workshops and things to simulate the experience, to provide that initial experience so that there's true lessons learned that we're starting from. So we're kind of kicking things off with a stronger security posture before we even get faced with that initial live test, because that's the more you can iterate through the testing of your plan, the better off things are going to be.
Yeah, I think that suggestion also implies rethinking, staying fresh, understanding that security vulnerabilities may change. And so having a platform to get in and rethink that, I think you mentioned like the ransomware workshops, I think is great. So let's transition to a new set of conversation here in terms of a question. So when it comes to preparation, what are some of the key details, pitfalls, best practices that you can share with our audience today?
Yeah, this, don't hate on me because this sounds super basic, but it really is the basics. What is your inventory, and not just what are the systems, but we see it on a routine basis. CISA has their own software inventory of known good things, no good packages. So it's really, and especially as software bill of materials, that's definitely something that's come to the forefront in terms of just requirements of doing business, because supply chain, it absolutely is another really heavily utilized attack vector, right? I would say as a best practice, I used to jokingly call it network archaeology, because I was constantly looking around and trying to figure out, what are the old things hanging out here that everybody forgot about, right?
Yeah.
But all jokes aside, that's the stuff that the attackers are also looking for, because they're the ones that are neglected, and that offers oftentimes the easiest foothold into the environment, and it also is usually a nice quiet place to operate, because everybody's zipping past and not really paying attention to that. So and it's not just systems, right? It's the accounts, the software, and there's a lot more to that inventory aspect, right? And then the next thing is to understand that it is absolutely a group app. Like incident response is very different. I think you kind of touched on it earlier as well, that with DR, that's kind of IT's thing, right? The rest of the company does their thing, and if there's a problem, they call IT, and IT does the DR piece. But when it comes to cyber incident response, that's all hands on deck, because it's going to affect or touch aspects of the business from every direction. And so when you're testing your plan, you really need to have stakeholders from every, and I'm not kidding, like every aspect of the business, to be able to walk through and say, okay, here's what we're doing for the initial investigation. Where are the pitfalls with that? What works, what doesn't. Get into that attacker mindset of, oh, here's my plan. How can this be disrupted at this point, right? And then, who is doing the investigation? Do I have somebody on retainer? Am I going to have to call a partner? Is my insurance company going to bring in their own? When they do that, does that mean I don't have access to anything at this point, or how long? Or there are a lot of those kinds of details that start coming out, and I can tell you with 100% certainty, during a live event is not the time you want to figure those answers out.
Yeah, that is that's not the situation you want to be in, for sure. I really think that what you shared around the inventory is extremely powerful. Again, it's the basics that matter, and again, once it's done, you don't just never do it again. You have to continually review what is there. In terms of like hardening and user management, I think those are also extremely important. And then, we haven't really touched on this today, but maybe a little bit. You implied root cause, like what caused the incident. But what we didn't touch on is there's some statistics out there around email indicating that I think something like 90% of attacks actually come in through like email phishing. And so ironically, I spent a long time also doing an email administration. And so I put a lot of prevention systems in place to ensure that these things weren't happening at the organizations I worked at. But you touched on AI and how AI is changing that as well. AI is really trying to, or at least the bad actors using AI are already creating attacks that come in through email in ways that those detection systems may not be able to catch. So root cause is critical. Have an eye on your email and make sure that you have the right prevention mechanisms in place and update them ongoing. I think it aligns with everything you shared on a broader scale, Jonathon, but I do want to call that out. And then the last thing I want to call out on, the pitfalls and best practices is to make sure you have the right monitoring in place. Monitoring all of this with the right notifications to the right teams can really help identify risks quickly. Going back to your earlier statement when we were talking earlier about how the poisoning and how these threats can just embed themselves, and you may not know they're there for a long period of time. But with the right monitoring and notification, sometimes that is another way to bubble that stuff up more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of one final note on the inventory that I didn't mention it explicitly, but it's worth it. Inventory the vulnerabilities. Like you need to understand if you've got bad configurations or vulnerable software running in your environment, you really need to understand where that is and why it's there. And sometimes there are legitimate reasons for it, but that's where you start getting into adding additional controls to bring that risk into a acceptable level, right? And so you kind of shifting back to what you mentioned with monitoring, I think that's kind of it sort of heads towards an interesting aspect of things. So, I've got a great plan. I test it on a regular basis. My monitoring is in really good shape. From your perspective, how do you prevent yourself from feeling too good about where you are?
Yeah. So having a plan with routine testing, first and foremost. So we talked about a lot about how to have a plan. So get that in place. But again, don't just assume you're done. Go in and test as often as you need to. That could be quarterly. And I think part of that is going to involve your backups, right? Because you need to know that you can recover from any situation. And then back to your comment about DR, that seems to be a theme today. We keep bringing that up, right? Disaster recovery is separate and different. Don't treat these as one and the same, because it's not always cyber proof. And then just one more thought on this, and maybe you can take it a little deeper, Jonathon, is the whole concept of a clean room. From a clean rooming perspective, I know some organizations don't have the luxury of having like a separate air-gapped, isolated environment online to recover for forensics analysis. But what are your thoughts on that? And any other lessons learned you want to share beyond that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, right? I mean, it's certainly every day my inbox or my news feed is there's lots of stories about vendor X just released whatever clean room thing, or it's a topic du jour for sure. And that it goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning. Like, it's fine to have things in place, but understand that the attackers are there to disrupt those plans. And so I've seen it happen where you've got this magnificent environment, the immaculate network built out, and then it gets compromised. And at that point, even the clean room that is intended to be, your safe haven to bring things back together could be compromised. So you always have to operate with that mindset of knowing that you can do so much to make things simple, but at some point you're going to be faced with a pretty rapid decision tree in order to navigate all this stuff. And so as you're evaluating your plan, as you're testing your plan, it's really, really important to ask the really hard questions. What happens if this piece is missing? Or go through the plan, it worked, great. Okay, what's the thing that I can change or take away or disrupt that makes that not work, right? Because I guarantee if you don't make it hard on yourself and put yourself into those tough spots to really, don't be afraid to show where the weaknesses are, because if you don't show them, the actor that you didn't want in your environment will absolutely show them for you, show them to you. Usually they're really friendly and they'll offer to coach you on all the things that they found for a fee. Not exactly the position you want to be in. But yeah, and you also touched on it, this is an iterative process, right? And so just because you have the plan in place, make sure that you're constantly reviewing things and that you've built out kind of a programmatic way to check things, test things. You mentioned as you were talking about testing the plan, it really made me think back to an article I read about the international airport in Tel Aviv ages ago. And they run essentially terrorist response drills multiple times a day, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's a really well-run airport. And you look at other airports where maybe they test their responses to things like that once a month, once a year. It's a very different outcome, right? And it's because that response is just part of the daily activity in the environment. And being in a network, it's no different. Don't be afraid to just make that part of the culture.
Yeah. All right. So let me transition then to putting this into practice. So how do you recommend putting some of the frameworks out there and the plans into reality?
Yeah, that is the tricky bit, right? It's always the organization puts it together, now prove that it works. And I mean, you already touched on this. Testing the plan regularly is hands down it's the best way to do it. And that can be really challenging, right? And depending on the size of your organization and your resources, I don't know about you, but I've not talked to very many organizations that have just an abundance of resource, where they're just
Right.
like, you know what, I've got 20% more people on staff than I know what to do with. We're all just sitting around. That has been said 0 times, I think, in the past several years. So, I mean, I understand that it is very difficult to do those things, and know your resources like CISA. There's a lot of NIST, SANS. I mean, there are a lot of really active organizations out there that have tools for both emulations, simulations, that you can, somebody who's not particular, you can get a relatively junior person to be able to effectively test things because of the capabilities in a lot of these tool sets. Don't be afraid to work with either, get involved with industry groups, right? And make friends within your peer. Contact the FBI field office near you. There are a lot of resources. Call us. We're happy to help, right? I mean, one of the things, I mentioned it kind of earlier, but one of the things I really appreciate that we do here, and that I've been able to be a part of, that's been pretty awesome, is to create these ransomware resilience workshops. And it's not a sales pitch. It's the ability to bring customers in and bring organizations together and to go through a real scenario so that they just have that frame of reference to understand what it is going to be like. And it was really awesome. I actually helped run one a couple of weeks ago, and one of the participants in the middle of it kind of leaned to the table captain and said, we had an event not too long ago. It was exactly like this. So it's that's the key, is if you can't make this happen on your own, stick your head up, call out. I guarantee there are ways that you can get kind of a real experience to work with. Because again, this is incident response. It's a cycle, right? And you respond, you work through your plan, and then you review and get your lessons learned and make adjustments. And so having whatever that initial experience is going to help you get better lessons to learn from, so that the first time you really need to put it into action, you're ready for it.
That's great. So in terms of summarizing today, we really dove into cyber response and why incident response matters more than, say, leaning on a disaster recovery plan. We also highlighted how enterprises should really challenge their plans. Maybe that's hiring somebody to do some testing, but also not just settle for the status quo. So, Jonathon, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. It was great to have you.
Absolutely.
And it was fantastic. And then just to close things out, that wraps up another episode of Spotlight on Security Tech Insights. Thank you, everyone.
Cool. We'll build cabinets next time.